He's an electioneer. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
Well,
You think
this is,
a boy's shooting fire?
I'm grateful for anybody who shows up.
Alan's here. Hello, Kim. Your son's here.
We're streaming, so if you're pleasure.
Okay,
And if you could talk into the mic.
so we'll test and see the sound, how that's going. Is that coming through all right?
I'll get to that.
All right, good morning, Louisburg disciples. We're going to spend a little time, and I appreciate the invitation to share a little bit with you about what's going on in our region, a region of which you are part, and for which I'm very grateful. I'd like to start actually with a video overview. This is the General Board Report video, and it has a group of faces around it, and I think we're...
General Board preamble?
Yes. Not the preamble. This is the General Board Report.
I don't see General
It's the icon with the opening shot is a number of small,
Okay.
yeah,
GKC.
that's it. Thank you. This is a report that we made to the General Board.
Ministry during this challenging season would not have been possible without the great support of the Office of General Minister and President, General Units, and the College of Regional Ministers.
We are grateful for our covenant partnership with the whole church.
We began hosting Zoom meetings for clergy and lay leaders for mutual support, case studies, and sharing best practices. So many disciples stepped up to meet the challenges with grace and faith. Interim ministers who lead congregations through times of transition. Pastors, musicians, and educators found new ways to work together. Congregations shared their expertise and offered libraries of resources to KC disciples. Conversations about how to meet safely and to prepare sanctuaries for limited worship attendance. An online Bible study featuring interviews with Dr. Walter Brueggemann. Our first ever online regional assembly.
Our Becoming Beloved community team was awarded 2 grants to translate workshop materials for use in our Latinx congregations, organize our first regional Juneteenth celebration, and offer continuing anti-racism education opportunities for all KC disciples.
Volunteers oversaw and raised over half of the funds to make over $50,000 in major repairs and upgrades at Tall Oaks.
First Christian Church in Independence and their after-school care for unaccompanied minors. Blue Valley Christian Church's groundbreaking work in a senior residential campus. Alpha E Omega Miriam Christian Church, and a grant from our region to purchase food in bulk and distribute boxes filled with enough to feed over 50 families.
Although 2020 will be remembered for new challenges, we disciples of Christ have so many reasons to give thanks to God and encouragement to one another.
That's just a small example of the many things that are going on in the life of the region. I want to stop for a moment and ask if you have any questions about anything that you saw.
You talked a little bit about what you've done out at Tall Oaks. Can you expand on that, or are you going to do that later?
No, this is as good a time as any to talk about Tall Oaks. We have engaged United Camps, Conferences, and Retreats to run the operations at Tall Oaks. One of the things that we finally came to an awareness of is that we're a part of a hospitality trades industry that's very competitive. And properties, just because they're owned by churches, don't necessarily attract business, especially when our business practices are sort of here and there. So we contracted with a professional company, and they hit the ground running. Unfortunately, so did COVID. So we contracted with them to start the 1st of August, and they went to work, and they significantly reduced the amount of money we were paying for operations. We've been running at a deficit at Tall Oaks for the last several years, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that comes out of money that would ordinarily be spent for regional programming. Well, What we also didn't anticipate was that at nearing the end of COVID, that there would be an employment shortage. We cannot hire enough people out at Tall Oaks. Even though they can work with fewer staff, this company's operational plan is so good that they can do more with fewer staff people. Unfortunately, though, we're having a really hard time getting folks to sign up. They've increased the rate of pay, but not much success. So this week, for instance, right after church, I head on up to Tall Oaks to clean toilets and clean up after the campers so that we can get ready for the next camp that's coming in tonight, because they couldn't contract with a cleaning service that was available to be able to do that. They got one for some of the campus, but not for all of it. And they continue to reach out to try to find some additional help, and we've called out for volunteers to help out in the short run. But in the long run, UCCR has been at this business for 50 years, and they've got a great reputation. We interviewed 2 regional ministers who have the same program, the same UCCR operational program in their regions, and they had nothing but good things to say about the company. And I will say that the company has stepped up in ways that I wouldn't have imagined. They're flying a lifeguard out for part of next week anyway, so that the kids can have access to the pool. In the meantime, we purchased some equipment so that the kids can have water play, because UCCR and their insurance policy will not allow swimming in the pool without a lifeguard. So it's been a challenge. Part of the way that we've helped to meet that, when we realized that we were losing a lot of money through the operations at Tall Oaks, was to sell off part of the campus that wasn't ever going to be developed and was never used. And we've been able to sell that to a farmer neighbor, and that's worked out really well. We still have over 200 acres, which is more than enough for what we need it for. But we're also looking at significant amounts of money to do the neglected maintenance and the repairs and the replacements and upgrades that are needed if we're going to be competitive. And that's the other shift that we've made, not only in the way we operate the campus, but in what the campus is for, its purpose. We used to think of Tall Oaks as our church camp, and that was good enough. And that was at a time when many, many disciple congregations would come and use the campus, and we were able to bring in enough income to be able to pay the staff and make the upkeep work. That hasn't been true for years. Right now, Disciples of Christ basically underwrite about 30% of the total Tall Oaks budget. So early on, people who came before us started contracting with other groups to use the campus. One of them is Camp Encourage. It's a camp for autistic kids. It's really something to see. You'd never be invited to be a guest because they take really good care of the kids, but there are 2 adults for every child. And for these kids, it's the only place they can go and have a week of enjoyment and personal and spiritual growth with the help and the supervision of as many adults. And Tall Oaks is their home now. And that's true now for several other groups that have come in, other denominations, other not-for-profits. Firefighters were out there last year doing recovery work from PTSD. And having served in the fire department for 12 years, I know something about those situations that stay with you and haunt you and need to be processed. And so it's been great to be able to offer a campus that these folks can show up and run programs safely. But that shift hasn't been made by the whole region. And that's something I'm hoping that either we do that or we come to the realization that we just don't care enough about it and let it go. So we're having conversations that are moving in that direction this year. I appreciate the question.
A couple follow-up questions, and then you added a comment that makes the third question. The first question is, I assume from your earlier comments that there's going to be more emphasis on the marketing side towards for-profit activities. And what about, second question, what about those for-profit uses then impacting Tall Oaks ministry?
That's a great question. Right now, that hasn't been an issue for us, and most of our marketing is directed toward not-for-profits and religious groups.
But doesn't that impact the balance sheet?
It does, and we have to be careful about that. Fortunately, our finances are managed by Disciple Treasury Services. There's a CPA who's in charge of that, the Vice President, John Goebel, and they manage our finances for the region. So They're very careful about those kinds of things. We know that there's only a certain percentage of business that you can do because we are a not-for-profit, a 501c3. I will say that maybe this would be helpful to know. Years ago, a couple of years ago, we in the region made the decision to create a Tall Oaks board that would be a 501c3, that it would be appointed by the region, but it could include people representing other user groups. And thank God for that, because one of those people on the board is Kelly Lee, who is the executive director of Camp Encourage for the Autistic Kids Camp. And she's been invaluable in helping us to think about what is it that Tall Oaks needs in order to be able to be more attractive, to be more accommodating for groups that want to use the facilities. So Camp Encourage got a grant to allow us to use special air purifiers in each of the cabins, which is a good thing. I'm sure many of you are aware that people with immunity disorders and people with allergies, that number seems to be increasing. And so being able to advertise when we invite people to Tall Oaks, hey, we do something to purify the air in the cabin, so that if you have an issue with that, you may just be more comfortable. But that's only because Kelly Lee made that grant application and thought it was important enough. And what we're hoping is that some of the groups that use Tall Oaks will decide to invest in it, and eventually we would turn over the operation of Tall Oaks to that not-for-profit board. We would still, by constitution and bylaws, appoint the board, but we would love to have more representatives from the user groups to help us understand. Plus, that puts us in touch with a greater support network, because each of those groups has funders and grantors that we would not normally have access to.
And when you commented about the entire region is not on the same wavelength, comment a little bit more about that. Is that individual churches that are?
We have congregations that participate in some nominal way or more, 74 out of 82 that are listed in the yearbook. Some congregations, they never did catch on to the change that was made in 1968 and 69. And they still operate pretty much the way they'll operate, and they have little or no connection. Unless they get in trouble, then I get a phone call. But many of our congregations over the years have become more concerned about their own survival than about the covenant relationship that we have with each other. And that's a problem. And of course, we see that in other areas of life. You see that in businesses that fail, when employees don't invest in their own company and make sure that they're doing whatever they can to assure the success of the company. We see it in communities where some people, how do I want to say this? Their house is their bedroom and not much more. Their investment in the life of the community is minimal at best. Well, that's affected the church. We have a lot of people who go to church but forget that we are called by Christ to be the church, and that we're church together. One of the pieces of good news that you saw in the video, and there's just not enough time to tell all of the stories, but we've had Zoom conferences where leaders of congregations have gotten together and shared best practices, whined to each other, prayed for each other. But the idea is that we're beginning to realize that we can't do this on our own. We've got to work together. That's a little bit easier to do when you're closer together geographically. When you're further out into the country, that makes it a little more difficult. But the Zoom, having been forced online, has given us a tool we didn't have before. And so one of the things that we have made available now is Elders Helping Elders is a Zoom call. It's on the second Sundays at 5 p.m. Usually people have wound down their barbecues in the afternoon and they're getting ready for the work week ahead. And although we don't have a huge turnout, the elders who do show up have had some really rich conversation about what's going on in their congregations that allows me then to learn, and other congregations to learn, how could we be more in support? Because elders, I think, have one of the toughest jobs. They are more than people who pray at the table. They are more than leaders of committees. They are more than board officers. They are spiritual overseers in the life of the church. And many elders don't feel like they're qualified or supported in those roles. And that's got to change, because unfortunately, I don't care how good a pastor is, there's no way a pastor can be the only spiritual director for any group of people, much less than for an active congregation. It really requires a close relationship with the elders. Fortunately, from what I hear from your pastor, there's more of that here than there are in some of the congregations that I visit, where there's such antipathy with the pastor and an unwillingness to work together, to collaborate. And to be fair, sometimes that works both ways. There are some pastors and some congregations that don't try as hard to get along with the elders. But the good news is there are more that are trying, and maybe because we have to. We're at a place right now where 30% of the people surveyed in the Kansas City metro area have said, we're not interested in religion, any religion. That wasn't true when you and I were growing up, not even close. There was an anticipation, an understanding that if you were going to be an adult in a community, which was largely, if only nominally Christian, that you would be a part of a church. Well, when a third of the people surveyed, adults across the age spectrum, say they're no longer interested, they don't want what we have to offer, we have several aging congregations that are wondering, what do we do? Does the gospel stop with us? How do we continue ministry when future generations are not knocking on our doors, when we're not even inviting them? And that's the sad part for me. When churches get to a state where we're embarrassed to bring visitors in because of some of the monkey business that's going on within the life of the congregation. And that often happens when a congregation feels stressed. And when we begin to look around and realize, my gosh, we don't have many children. Fortunately, you do. But in many of our congregations, I'm 65, and I would be the youngest person to show up to that congregation on Sunday morning. And they're really scared. They don't know what to do. And when people are scared, sometimes their behavior, let's just say we're not on our best behavior when we're feeling really frightened. And so it takes remembering that we've been here before. There are a lot of people who are faithful Roman Catholics in the 1500s who thought the world is just falling apart, the church has fallen apart. Well, we're still here 500 years later. We're doing church differently. We're not all doing it the same way like we might have done at one time in the life of the church. We'll get through this. We'll get through this because God is not finished with the church yet. Great questions. Thank you. And by the way, I want to acknowledge that he came up to the Alta Vista Christian Church and helped to do a foundation assessment, which was a very generous thing to do. I wish we could have had the pastor be more cooperative, but I have all the power of a suggestion. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to move on then. We have a church officer Zoom. We won't have it this Sunday. I knew better than to do that on the 4th of July. But those who are not elders, or even if they are, but they're church officers who are trying to think through, how do we work through the financial challenges that we have? How do we look at our structure? How do we work better together? We're holding those Zoom conferences. Again, not many show up, but those that do enjoy the conversation, and they both benefit from it. We're teaching now board officers to think about the ways of scripting out future plans that are more likely to succeed than a hurry-up meeting at the board. So one of these pieces is a theory of change, and we're using it for our regional board meeting. We're going to have a board retreat at the end of July, and we're going to be taking some models that have been used very successfully in the business world to help us learn how to script out where we get from here to where we believe God wants us to be. So the first priority, of course, is prayer. Reading the scriptures, being clear about what it is that God wants from us at this time in the life of the church. And then getting down to the brass tacks about, okay, once we have a sense of where we need to be, then how do we get there? And can we script that out in ways that hold us accountable for outcomes rather than, well, we had a great plan 6 months ago. We were all in agreement. We held a congregational vote. And 6 months later, what happened? Well, the paper's sitting in a file drawer somewhere, and the plan hasn't been acted, or it was tried and we found resistance. So another process that we're going to be working with board officers and pastors with is called immunity to change. There's been some great study done around this phenomenon that each one of us has a built-in allergy to accountability for results. Why is that? Well, what we do is we work with individuals, we work with a group, but work with them individually to kind of map out what is it about me that doesn't want to follow through what I say I want to accomplish. And what can I do about that so that I can actually be a part, I can be invested, and we can actually enjoy a better outcome than what we might have if I didn't know that about myself. And by doing this together in a group, we can be supportive of each other and we can have a healthy level of accountability. I have to tell you that as a person who was raised in and served in the Roman Catholic Church for many years before becoming a disciple of Christ, one of the big differences I noticed was this issue of accountability. We prize our independence and our autonomy so much that some things begin to fall apart and we let them. And then we get scared. But in organizations where there's a high level of healthy accountability, not I'll tell you what to do and if you don't do it, you're accountable to me. That's not the kind of accountability I'm talking about. It's more like the accountability that we have with our spouses, with our children, with our school systems, with our employers. I'm accountable for the success of this organization, and I contribute. It may not be my fault if we fail, but it's a shared responsibility. And if I want to be more Christ-like, I will embrace that accountability, and I will work, and I will overcome some of my resistance to change.
On that, Bill, it seems to me like there's a really tremendously big difference between independence and license. And the temptation on the part of individuals, oftentimes, as I see it, is when they see independence, they have a tendency to think license
Yes.
and not pay attention
Yeah.
to responsibility.
We think more about the freedom from and not enough about the freedom for. You know, with liberty comes responsibility. It always has. It's always come at the cost of people acting responsibly. But that's easy to forget. I'm more and more aware that I have as much tendency to backslide as I do to move forward. And coming into that awareness has helped me then, humbled me, honestly. And one of the gifts that I treasure the most is to be around people who love me enough to hold me accountable when I'm going off the rails. I'm just
That oftentimes involves or necessitates confrontation.
yes.
And our whole culture seems to think confrontation is bad.
Right. We lose control. I think we worship an unholy trinity from time to time. You'll hear about this in the sermon. The three C's: certainty, comfort, and control. Don't tell me I know everything I need to know. I like my comforts, and I like being in control. If Jesus had operated that way, we wouldn't be sitting here today. I think Philippians 2 is a great example of the kind of approach that we're called to take as disciples. And that's the other piece. You know, I remember I was baptized as an infant and then confirmed as a youth in the Roman Catholic Church. And I've done so many baptisms as a pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I'm sad to say that many people who are baptized never really sign on to the work of the church. It's really not in their mind when they come for baptism. They're more concerned about their salvation, soul salvation. But discipleship is so much more than that. It's an invitation to be in partnership with Jesus in the greatest project on the planet Earth. Yeah, I like it that we can fly a helicopter on Mars. But wouldn't it be something if at night the 2.3 billion Christians who inhabit this planet today could ever work together to make sure that nobody goes to bed hungry at night, or to make sure that nobody has to go to into an abusive home, or not have shelter. not have the basic necessities of life that we all enjoy or want to enjoy. And we could. It's not impossible. Sometimes I think Jesus' teaching on evangelism, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, immersing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them everything that I've commanded you. I don't know that it was so much about saving souls as just good math. If you're going to affect a change on a culture to make it healthier, you're going to need everybody. And making disciples is not a matter of persuasion. I have yet to scare anybody into the body of Christ. But if my behavior and my words collectively, as a part of the whole church, inspire someone to say, I'd like to be a part of that movement, now we're talking discipleship. And sometimes in our congregations, we've forgotten that. And we've been content with the membership that we have, and we haven't really roused ourselves too much to be thinking about people who have no idea that there is a God who loves them and cares for them so much more than they know. And that saddens me and keeps me in the game. We're dealing, if you were halfway awake last summer, you also know that we are now as a nation talking more and more about the inequities that we have historically between people of different races. And one of the pieces that we're working on that we think will be helpful is a process called transformative community conversations or conferences. We're learning from the person who wrote the book about how communities that had people who used to square off against each other had learned to find a common way forward that was mutually beneficial. Here's an example. In Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a group of migrant workers who would never call the police when a crime was committed because they were scared. They thought the police didn't like them, that they had heard stories of unusually cruel treatment. Whether they were true or not, they heard the stories and they had every reason to feel afraid. The police, on the other hand, their experience with some of the migrant workers and some of the crimes that were committed was pretty negative, and so there were attitudes that were formed in both camps. Well, this process brought people together around a maxim that said, the problem is the problem. The people are not the problem is the problem. And if we can focus on the problem and how we got to this place, what are the narratives, what are the stories that drove us to this place where we couldn't get along, where the workers wouldn't report crimes and the police then couldn't intervene, and the relationships would just get further and further strained. So as a process, they looked at this. They did a little coaching, a little practicing, so people got a sense of how to work this. They looked at the way that they got to the place that they were, and they asked themselves, do we want to continue this story? Or do we want a different narrative going forward? And they agreed. They wanted something better. They were not content with what they had. So they came up with a really creative solution. The police chief said, you know what? When there's a crime that you want to report, I want you to call the dispatcher, and I only want you to speak Spanish. I have 2 dispatchers who are bilingual, and they will hear your report, and they will share it with me. And I will make sure that when we will respond respectfully, and we will take care of the issue, because we want you to report the crimes that are committed to you or among you. And it worked for a while. Like everything else, it works well for a while. People are excited. People are feeling good about this. And we begin to drift back into old narratives. So it's a process of continually reevaluating. What are the narratives that got us to the place of discontent? What are the narratives that get us to a place of peace and enjoyment? And what can we do to keep furthering those? So rather than playing the blame game, we have an approach now that we think we can share with congregations. We're learning how to do this. We haven't quite gotten all the training yet, but that's something we're doing with the life of the general church. I serve on the Reconciliation Commission, by the way, and we are working together to help congregations to work with this. Ministry innovation circles. We know that the future is going to look different, but how? And we also know that nobody's going to tell us what our future is going to look like. We are going to have to discern that. So, Reverend Dr. Deleslyn Kennebrew is our regional minister for ministry innovation, and she's amazing. She has a law degree, a Master of Divinity, and a network like you would not believe all over the country of people who have started new churches or who have taken churches that were on the downhill slide and revitalized them. So we called her almost 3 years ago just to do that work. She has nothing else in her portfolio that she's required to do. And she's been working with some congregations who've invited her in, but now we know that not every congregation's ready, so she's created these Zoom conferences, and they take place on Thursday afternoons from 12 to 1. And there were 20 people that showed up last time. And they weren't all from within our region. Some were from other denominations in the metro, some were from other places in the country, disciples in other regions. And we like it that way, because that's a great way. There's a lot of fertile ground to plow together. So that's happening, and anybody can click in on that. And we advertise this in our newsletter. We put a newsletter out at least once a month, and usually I will do that twice. And we put those events up there for people. You may know from hearing from Pastor Justin about the Tri-Regional Partnership Initiative. Well, we figured if we're going to ask congregations to work together, why don't we ask regions to do the same thing? Are there some things that we do as a region that we could do better if we did them together? So for instance, educational programs for leaders. Why are we just limiting those to one region? Why are we duplicating those resources? Why are we not sharing them in a broader sense? And so Pastor Justin's been a really important part of that, and I'm really grateful to him for that. You'll hear more about that because we're still in the infancy stages, but this is a facilitated conversation with regional ministers and 3 people from each region who are now working together. And it's amazing, in just 6 months, this group has really begun to coalesce and care about each other, which is always a good sign. As we begin to know each other and begin to respect and care for each other, it makes it easier then to work with each other, especially around challenging issues. Funding obviously has been an issue, and Disciples Mission Fund, I'm going to ask you to show that video if you would, David, because even many in our churches have no idea what Disciple Mission Fund is and how it works.
Which one? What's it called?
Disciple Mission Fund,
No.
DMF.
Oh, there it is.
Hello, today we are going to show you how your offering supports mission from your doorstep to the ends of the earth. Disciples Mission Fund, or DMF, is the common mission fund supporting more than 70 ministry partners of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States, Canada, and around the globe. Your local congregation decides whether a percentage of the offerings received in your church or a fixed amount of your church's budget will be given as denominational mission support. Your church treasurer then sends a check to the Disciples Mission Fund. The money is then distributed twice a month to ministries. This means your and your congregation's offerings go many places. First, your offering goes to your region, which will use these funds to support congregations looking for pastors, provide camp and conference experiences for children and help with strategic planning, host clergy retreats, provide ministries for men and women, and so much more. Your offering also goes to the general and racial ethnic ministries of the church, which support many ministries, overseas missions in 90 countries, ministerial relief, teaching stewardship and generosity, equipping congregations for missional transformation, training leaders, supporting ministries, supporting our ecumenical and interfaith providing for the general minister and staff, and so much more. And finally, your offering is shared with the colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity houses in covenant with the church. These funds provide scholarships, spiritual support for students, chaplains, church relations offices, and leadership development opportunities like religious-based study abroad and participation in general church events like the General Assembly. Disciples Mission Fund also has 4 special day offerings: Easter for general and racial ethnic ministries, Pentecost to help start new churches, Thanksgiving for higher education, and Christmas for your region. And that's just a small glimpse of how your offering supports mission around the globe. You can learn more about Disciples Mission Fund, see how much your congregation is given, and how that money was shared by visiting www.disciplesmissionfund.org.
How many of you have seen that or knew about that? Okay. Fewer and fewer of our churches know about that. And that was designed to make sure that all the expressions of the church had adequate financial support. Regions get 41 cents, this region gets 41 cents on the dollar that's contributed to the Disciple Mission Fund. The rest of that funds those other ministries that were being described. But DMF, Disciple Mission Fund, has been going downhill for the last 3 decades. And part of what's happened is that churches sort of done designer giving. And this is not to disparage, but it is a phenomenon, and at some point we're going to have to ask the question about this. I give to what I want to give. And sometimes that means I don't support something from which I benefit. And we've had this conversation with congregations for years, and we're looking at what can we do to help congregations that want to be supportive of the whole ministry of the church and not just the part that they like. But in other areas of society, we're seeing that in our communities, we're seeing that in consumer spending. You know, we buy what we want to buy, the way we want to buy it. And whether or not there are negative consequences beyond me, well, you know, that's their problem, not mine. We've got to change that mindset. Yeah. In addition to that, we're working in Search and Call with 7 congregations right now. Pastors are burning out faster than we had ever imagined. COVID was really tough. I don't know about you all, but I never did get training as a TV producer. And in some congregations where they didn't have any tech people, it was the pastors who had to set up the video equipment, run the internet, and then preach online, which is a little embarrassing from time to time because now you're being seen by people who access the internet. Community Christian Church, for example, 40% of their worshipers are online and they're across the country. So every Sunday, you better come up with a home run sermon. Well, that's a lot of pressure. Moreover, you're speaking with people you don't know. One of the things that saddens me whenever I preach in a local congregation is that I don't get to know the folks intimately, to know everybody's story, to know the language, to know the issues in the community. When I was a parish pastor, I knew all that. I spent a lot of time drinking coffee and sweet tea with lots and lots of people, visiting people in the nursing home, going to hospital visits, doing funerals and weddings and baptisms. And you get to know people so that when you preach, you have the ability to listen to what God wants to say and translate that into a language that people want to hear. I don't get to do that as a regional minister. I have to give it my best shot based on some relationships I've had with some folks in the past. And now that it's broadcast online, wow, talk about nerves. So that's different, but we're working with them. We now have formed, as a result of that, the Disciples Tech Corps. That's brand new this year. I've been part of a small group that's helped to pull that together, and these are people who work tech for a living. And they're making themselves available to disciple congregations to offer advice, or in some cases where they need more than advice, they need a professional consultation and some additional help, paid help. These folks are making themselves available to congregations to help with that. So we are trying to stay alert to what congregations are facing and trying to come up with ways to help be more supportive, but realizing we can't do that for congregations. We have to do that with congregations, which means sometimes, I love this way Ernesto Soroli says, sometimes we just have to shut up and listen and pay attention to what people are telling us so that when we come out with something that we hope will be helpful, they recognize their input. And that's going to lead me, I think we got church service coming up soon. Yeah, I want to be careful not to overstep. We're leading a series of conversations about covenant. And actually next Sunday at 8 o'clock in the morning, I will be online facilitating one of the 5 sessions that we'll hold at 8 o'clock on Sunday mornings online. And that's to help us revisit what we understand by our covenant with God and with each other. It's been 50 years, more than 50 years, since the design of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Well, we don't drive cars that old. without making sure that they get maintained. I know there are some farmers that have 50-year-old tractors, and they do that because they're constantly looking under the hood, checking the tires, and making sure that there's enough axle grease to get the thing going. We need to do the same thing with our covenant with God and with each other. It's been a while since we revisited. So what we're doing is doing something different. We've never done this before. We have some materials that have been prepared for 5 sessions. They generally last about an hour long, and they're meant to engage folks in conversation and then to get feedback from that conversation. And I happen to chair the governance committee, which is collecting that information so that it will shape any future adaptations that we make as a general church denomination. It will reflect your input. So I want to make a personal invitation to any of you who may be interested. The class I'm going to be leading, it's not a class really, it's a conversation. That's not the only option. In fact, what we'd love for that to take place within each congregation. The materials are self-explanatory, they're very easy to use, and again, they're meant to catalyze conversation, not to tell you what covenant is. It's rather to go over the history, the narrative of how we got to where we are, and ask the question, is there something we should be doing differently? Something we could be doing better? Does it really matter to us that we're in covenant with each other? And if it does, then we want to take that information back and make sure that that information gets out to the whole church. I could say more about ordinations. We have 2 candidates who are being ordained in the fall. Thank you for your support of them. They never met you, but without your support, they wouldn't have been able to go through seminary, they wouldn't have qualified for scholarships that the region was able to provide, and they wouldn't be so brave to try to do ministry in a church that's changing so rapidly. We can't guarantee that they'll have a full-time position anymore, but they're willing to step up, and they're willing to serve as ministers, and you help to make that happen. We could say more about pastoral care for pastors and lay leaders and administration, but I think you get a picture. We stay busy. We hope that we're also being productive and supportive. That's our fervent hope. Questions, comments, snide remarks? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.